Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country that I live and work on, the Larrakia, and pay my respects to past and present elders and to all First Nations people in the room and at the conference. This always was and will be Aboriginal land. My name's Liam. I'm a settler researcher at Menzies School of Health Research in Darwin. My work is focused on housing, homelessness and infrastructure policy, and I'm here to speak today about Homelands Policy. Thank you very much to AHANT and especially to Joan and Donna for organising a fantastic and important conference. It's been great and it's always a privilege to work with you. Today I'll speak to 4 questions. How has Homelands Policy failed the Homelands Housing and Infrastructure Program? What is the history of policy neglect for Homelands? How might we understand Homelands Policy today? And where should we go from here? At the outset, I want to emphasise the significance of Homelands to Aboriginal people and life worlds. As AHANT chairperson Alan Mole stated last year, Homelands are deeply embedded in the spiritual and cultural fabric of Aboriginal life. They carry the stories, traditions, songlines and knowledge passed down through generations of people. Others, such as Annie, Donald, Joyce and Yarnamul yesterday, are much better placed than me to speak to Homeland's history and significance. This talk limits its focus to policy shortcomings for addressing that significance. Allow me to begin with a quick summary of recent federal funding for Homelands housing, which Leanne described yesterday. So in October 2022, the Commonwealth Government announced $100 million for urgent works at NT Homelands. This was the first significant funding for Homelands housing for about a decade. In 2024, as part of the $4 billion remote housing package, a further $120 million over 3 years was committed to Homelands by the Commonwealth Government. The original $100 million investment underpinned the establishment of the Homelands Housing and Infrastructure Program, or the HIP, initially for 2 years and extended for 2024 to 2027. For the past few years, the HIP has operated alongside the NT Government's underfunded Homelands program. The HIP funding has been necessary and welcome, but $220 million is well below the $1.1 billion estimated by a 2022 audit to bring Homelands housing and infrastructure to a safe and functional standard, notably not the same standard under the Residential Tenancies Act. Without indexation, this assessed need equates to 27.5 years of HIP investment at current levels. So there's an obvious need to scale up Homelands investment significantly from current levels. Last year I finished a 2-year evaluation of the HIP. Thank you very much to everyone here who participated in that evaluation. Across its initial years, the HIP involved the delivery of housing and essential services, infrastructure upgrades at NT Homelands, as well as sub-programs focused on fire and electrical safety, water testing and supply, and housing sanitation. A number of those projects and sub-programs are considered in detail in this report, along with recommendations related to those 6 key areas. Broadly speaking, the HIP has been a well-administered and effective program, but I'm not here to speak about it specifically. Instead, I'm interested in how the HIP's implementation exposed the shortcomings of Homelands Policy. There are many issues we could speak on here, especially infrastructural ones, but I'll limit myself to 2 issues that were very obvious throughout the HIP evaluation, those being new and replacement houses and Homelands eligibility. To date, the HIP has not supported the construction of new housing at Homelands. This is despite the wishes of many Homelands residents and despite the poor condition of many dwellings. The original Federation funding agreement schedule underpinning the HIP was not explicit in precluding house construction, which meant that various Homeland service providers proposed projects based on extensive community consultation for new housing. The program was eventually narrowed to housing upgrades only, and ahead of the HIP's renewal in 2024, the sector again received signals that replacement housing, at least, would be supported and proposed such projects. But the superseding and current FFA schedule in 2024 stated that, quote, "The The schedule does not support the delivery of new or replacement houses on homelands, noting further work is underway by the Joint Steering Committee to inform housing arrangements for homelands on expiry of the schedule. If regional work plans identify any houses that require urgent replacing, the JSC may consider their inclusion. We'll come back to this. To date, I know of no such instances of housing identified and replaced, but I'm happy to be corrected. But instead, without addressing this policy issue, the de facto position to refuse to build new houses on homelands, reflective of government's 2-decade-long prioritisation of a secure tenure strategy, the need for leasing, has been continued. In various circumstances, the relative funding scarcity in the face of long-term government neglect of homelands has been used to justify the commitment to refurbishments over new homes. That is, new houses have been framed as too expensive or for too few households compared to refurbishments. But what's the result of this policy failure? At homelands, residents have been confused and angry about why old dwellings were being renovated rather than replaced, and anxious that, in the absence of any long-term, ongoing, secure funding, that this would be their only chance for housing improvements. To quote one resident, "We don't want these houses renovated. We need new houses. I have a teenage son. He's living in their 2-bedroom shed. It's not okay." Service providers, some of whom had originally proposed new construction and done all that work, were required to renovate fit-for-demolition dwellings. To be clear, Aboriginal community-controlled organisations, many of which I had the privilege of working with for this evaluation, completed such projects to a high standard and with extensive resident co-design. But stepping back, we should ask whether the result, refurbishments to dwellings that nowhere else in Australia would be considered appropriate to renovate, is a good one. Indeed, while such dwellings are notably improved, they are much better than they were, their form evidences a long policy history of inadequate provisioning, from Department of Aboriginal Affairs return to country grants to support basic shelters, to small-scale Homelands Extras allowance additions, to HIP refurbishments. Minor patches, fixes and additions have always characterised Homelands Policy. This is what Senator Thorpe is referring to as band-aids and rations. While the HIP made genuine attempts to share decision-making, such as in relation to selecting the homelands for refurbishment projects, and they were genuine, other program constraints were determined by governments by relying on existing positions. In the NT, there are about 380 funded homelands, which means practically that a homeland is supported through the NT government's Homelands program. Only funded homelands were eligible to receive HIP funding. As many of you know well, the status of funded homeland depends on meeting various eligibility criteria, including the presence of sustainable potable water, a power supply and safe and secure housing, accessibility, and an available service provider. A funded homeland must also be a place of principal residence determined through an NT government occupancy survey. There are many reasons why a specific homeland may become unoccupied and therefore unfunded. Residents may move to a remote community or town for work, family, health, cultural and other reasons. Or residents might vacate homelands after a long period of governments underfunding the necessary infrastructure to live in habitable circumstances on country. Once a homeland has been defunded, it's unlikely to have safe and secure housing or functional drinking water or power infrastructure. And without such amenities, it's difficult to establish an unfunded homeland as one's principal place of residence. A catch-22 obviously exists. Without access to Homelands program funding, it's next to impossible to improve the state of a homeland's infrastructure to become eligible for ongoing support. The HIP restricted projects to funded homelands, citing the extensive needs in those communities, which they are extensive. But this was despite the wishes of some traditional owners who sought for HIP funds to be invested at previously occupied but defunded homelands, and without, and this is important, without a clear pathway to re-establish this funded status. In this way, the prior neglect of homelands that made it too difficult to live there, especially for very remote homelands, is reinforced through their exclusion from the HIP. These parts are shorter. The achievements and ongoing benefits of homelands should be attributed to residents' strength and resilience and to service providers' ingenuity and grit. But before I turn to Homelands policy today, I want to argue that the condition of Homelands housing and infrastructure is an outcome of a decades-long policy inheritance. I've written about this history elsewhere, so here I just want to quickly highlight 4 key moments for understanding the present. Moment 1. Following the establishment of self-government in 1978, an exchange of letters between the Commonwealth Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Fred Chaney, and NT Chief Minister Paul Everingham clarified that the NT government would manage municipal and local services, local government services in 42 remote communities, while the Commonwealth government would retain responsibility for policy, planning and coordination in Aboriginal affairs. In addition, the NT government would play no decision-making or funding role in homelands, with Chaney from the Commonwealth stating that, quote, "In my view, homelands are not townships where residents might expect to have municipal services provided." 2 contemporary issues are very recognisable in this exchange. First, the policy and operational responsibilities of the 2 levels of government have long been subject and continue to be subject to dispute. Second, the long history of distinguishing between remote communities and homelands in terms of their required amenity. Do homelands really need housing? Do they really need ablutions? And so on. Moment 2, as Leanne discussed. In 1987, the influential Return to Country, or Blanchard Report, supported homelands and residents' commitment to them, and it set expectations for ongoing investment from governments. The report identified that because homelands were governed by Commonwealth, state and territory policies, the, quote, "diversity of support agencies has resulted in some confusion due largely to the lack of clarity of responsibilities and the extent of support they will direct to the homelands movement." As though it were written yesterday, the report also identified the catch-22 for residents to establish a homeland without a bore drilled by government, and government's unwillingness to drill a bore without the prior demonstration of commitment to the site by prospective residents. Go live there without drinking water, then we'll come and drill your bore. Moment 3, very familiar one. Following the intervention in 2007, a memorandum of understanding between the Commonwealth and NT governments outlined new federal funding for construction, repairs and refurbish and upgrades of housing in 73 remote communities. This funding was contingent on the NT government, quote, "taking over responsibility for the delivery of services to outstations," and it excluded the use of Commonwealth funding for constructing houses on homelands. This was explicit. Dismantling the ACO sector was also an explicit goal. Quote, "both governments agree that the funding will facilitate the transition from Indigenous community-controlled housing to a public housing model, the model that we seek to return to today." Until the 2007 MOU, the Commonwealth Government was chiefly responsible for funding housing and infrastructure on homelands, and by its own design. Since the NT Government inheritance of those responsibilities, consecutive policies have signalled the prioritisation of investment at remote communities with little intention to replace or construct new houses at homelands. Many of you know this because you've lived it. And finally, moment 4. In 2021, another exchange of letters and related parliamentary dialogue, this time between NT Minister for Housing, Chancey Paik, and Minister for Indigenous Australians, Ken Wyatt. Paik claimed that, quote, "the responsibility for new houses on homeland still sits with the Australian government," while a spokesperson for Minister Wyatt retorted that, quote, "the NT government remains responsible for housing, including on homelands." And while this disagreement retreads exasperating historical positions, it also prompted the establishment of an advisory committee on homelands, the precursor to today's Joint Steering Committee for Remote Housing, Housing on Homelands Working Group, which includes representation from both levels of government, the 4 land councils and Aboriginal Housing NT. So today it's common to hear statements that, quote, the Northern Territory needs a Homelands policy, and Homelands is a policy void. There is, of course, no singular remote communities policy. Remote communities are governed by a thicket of funding agreements, strategies, frameworks, program guidelines, implementation plans, service contracts, and so on. And Homelands are similarly objectified through governmental arrangements, documents, processes. On the other hand, there are various nominal Homelands policies. Greg Marks argued that the 2008 National Indigenous Reform Agreement was a Homelands policy by another name. But more explicitly, 2009's Working Future Outstations Homelands Policy and 2015's Homelands Policy, a Shared Responsibility, are examples of named Homelands policy. The 2015 policy stated that, quote, the Northern Territory Government has no immediate plans to build new houses on Homelands or establish new homelands. So no immediate plans become sedimented over time as government position. So we might understand this policy landscape in terms of anthropologist Tess Lee's distinction between the policy artefact and the policy ecology. The artefact is the singular Homelands policy. The ecology is the collection, the mess of processes that direct Homelands governance, including the haunting effects of historical plans, decisions, statements, approaches. Which is to say that even in the absence of a nominal or a current policy artefact, Homelands policy can obviously be understood as the cumulative approach and impacts of governments on homelands. When people reference a Homelands policy void or vacuum, and they did many times in the evaluation, it's not because they misunderstand how all these arrangements work, they do. Instead, this sort of refrain judges the deficiency of policy to effectively address Homelands' infrastructural needs. So one respondent to the HIP evaluation stated that, quote, there's actually no statement by either government about their policy intent and the framework that sits around the HIP investment. There's been no overt acceptance of what, if they're responsible, what they're responsible for, and how they're going to deliver it. There's a real vacuum of accountability on this. And another respondent characterised the situation of ad hoc investment without clarifying ongoing responsibilities, a sort of gift economy, as, quote, a palliative policy. The conditions for people on their homelands have been allowed to decline. It's doing nothing to support people to stay there or thrive there. The Hindi concept of jugaad is useful, I think, for understanding the work undertaken by Homeland service providers where operating on the smell of an oily rag is a really popular metaphor, characterises what they have to do with what they have. Jugaad is used to characterise unconventional, creative, flexible approaches to complex challenges with scarce resources, like using motorcycle engines to power small tractors, or closer to home, delivering high-quality refurbishments to tin shed dwellings in lieu of policy support for more substantial construction. We might stretch jugaad to characterise Homelands policy itself, in particular the piecemeal and ad hoc approach to Homelands investment, alongside the ongoing deferrals of governments to clarify their infrastructural obligations and commitments. But instead, I think the past decades of Homelands policy are better understood as the state's managed retreat from homelands in the form of a slow withdrawal. One-off investments have been insufficient to counteract funding attrition elsewhere, and the circumstances to live and work on country have become increasingly difficult and precarious. But to conclude, hopefully with a more hopeful or actionable tone, the present moment presents a significant opportunity to shift Homelands policy. So the June 2024 Partnership Agreement for Remote Housing and Homelands committed all JSC members to, quote, working together through the JSC to develop a long-term policy position for homelands within the first 2 years of the agreement including in relation to new and replacement homes. So we're now 6 weeks from that 2-year deadline. So what can we expect and what might we hope for? Given the success of the HIP to date, I would speculate, my opinion only, that continued funding for housing refurbishments at Homelands is likely, though never guaranteed. Given the scenario of refurbishing tin shed dwellings, I expect the JSC will also seek to clarify criteria or a formula like at remote communities around beyond economic repair or something similar, by which existing dwellings might qualify for replacement. I think that's what we can expect if I had to put money on it. But Homelands cannot thrive by refining eligibility criteria for replacement dwellings alone, nor by continuing the long era of politicised and intermittent funding. As Dr. Garwan Gumana argued following the intervention, the lack of policy clarity and related investment has allowed Homelands housing and infrastructure to deteriorate to standards that are not acceptable elsewhere in contemporary Australia and which undermine traditional owners' right to live on country. It also undermines the delivery of well-intentioned programs delivered responsibly, such as the HIP. Instead, my opinion, a more comprehensive policy response is required in the form of a nominal Homelands policy, or at the very least, a Homelands housing policy, a policy artefact to direct broader operations of government. There are many things that we should demand of such a policy, but allow me to conclude by suggesting 6 high-level requirements. First, the policy should provide a shared vision for the future of Homelands that recognises their cultural significance and importance to the wider housing system. Relative to obligations under the United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the ALRA, and Closing the Gap, this requires governments to recognise their obligations to Homelands, including housing and infrastructure. Second, and recognising the obligation to enact the shared vision, the policy should commit to funding the necessary infrastructure to support thriving Homelands, at least concurrent to the 2034 timeline of the Remote Housing Agreement, and providing funding surety to the sector. Third, the policy should commit to replacing dilapidated Homelands housing and building new housing to meet residents' needs, explicitly rejecting the prior position that government leasing must precede housing investment. It's a nonsense. We all know examples where housing's been built without leases preceding it. Fourth, the policy must include a pathway for establishing new and re-establishing defunded Homelands, supported by a specific Homelands Establishment Fund to facilitate grants to meet infrastructural requirements. Fifth, the policy must clarify how any housing investment occurs alongside requisite essential services infrastructure development, meeting obligations under Closing the Gap Target 9B. And I think we should be cognizant there of the way discrete communities are defined in relation to having populations of 50 people or more, and not let that definition flow into how we think about what is a homeland that warrants infrastructural investment in the Northern Territory. There's a lot of places with fewer than 50 residents that shouldn't be excluded by that definition formed elsewhere. And finally, the policy should clarify how Homelands residents, as sovereign owners of their land, will direct decision-making about policy development, program design and investment at Homelands into the future. Anything less than meeting these requirements and the accusation of a Homelands policy void is likely to continue and to be legitimate. Thank you.